Betrayal leaves a scent that never truly washes out. In the brutal winter of 1452, Rosalind Cartwright learned this the hard way. Stripped of her dignity and publicly shattered by the future alpha she was destined to love, she did the unthinkable. She ran into the unforgiving wilds. She thought she had escaped the cruelty of wolves to live quietly among men. But she didn't know that the terrifying Alpha King himself had caught her scent on the northern wind. The great hall of the Henderson estate was a cavern of rough-hewn stone and roaring hearths, steeped in the suffocating opulence of the western reaches. It was the night of the winter solstice, the most sacred evening in the lycanthrope calendar, where the veil between the moon goddess and her children was thinnest. Tapestries depicting legendary wolf hunts hung from the rafters, absorbing the thick haze of wood smoke, roasted venison, and the overwhelming musk of hundreds of wolves in their human skins. For Rosalind Cartwright, the feast was not a celebration, but a grueling shift of servitude. As a low-ranking, orphaned pack member, a healer's apprentice, who barely possessed the wolf strength to shift without exhaustion, she was relegated to the shadows. She wore a simple, undyed wool gown, her hands calloused from grinding yarrow and willow bark, her dark hair woven into a tight, practical braid. She navigated the perimeter of the hall, carrying heavy silver pitchers of spiced wine, keeping her eyes cast downward to avoid the predatory glares of the high-born enforcers. Tonight was her 18th birthday. It was the age of awakening, the night her inner wolf would mature enough to recognize her fated mate. A foolish, romantic part of Rosalind had hoped for a humble guard, or perhaps a kind merchant from the lower valleys. Someone who would take her away from the harsh, indentured life she lived under the thumb of Lord Reginald Henderson, the ruling alpha. Then the heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned open, and the scent hit her. It was not a gradual realization. It was a violent, earth-shattering collision of senses. The smell of winter pine, crushed mint, and the sharp, metallic tang of an impending thunderstorm slammed into Rosalind's chest. Her silver tray clattered against a stone pillar, the spiced wine sloshing dangerously. Her breath hitched. Her inner wolf, usually a quiet, timid creature, slammed against the confines of her ribcage, howling a single deafening word. Mate. Rosalind's eyes darted through the crowd, panic and a strange, terrifying euphoria warring within her. The sea of velvet-clad nobles parted. Walking down the center of the hall was Arlo Henderson, the alpha Heir. He was devastating in his brutal beauty. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of polished bronze and eyes like chips of amber, Arlo commanded the room with effortless arrogance. He wore a tunic of deep forest green embroidered with gold thread, a heavy fur mantle draped over one shoulder. But it wasn't his wealth that made Rosalind's knees buckle. It was the invisible magnetic tether that had just snapped into place between his soul and hers. Arlo stopped, his amber eyes widened slightly, the pupils dilating until they were almost entirely black. He inhaled sharply, his head snapping in Rosalind's direction. The music cacophony of lutes and heavy drums seemed to fade into a dull hum. The air between them crackled with ancient, undeniable magic. For a fleeting second, Rosalind saw recognition in his gaze. She saw the undeniable pull of the moon goddess's design. And then she saw the disgust. The warmth in Arlo's eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating sneer. He looked at her coarse woolen dress, her flour-dusted apron, the smudge of soot on her cheek. Then his gaze shifted to the dais where Lady Catherine stood. Catherine, the daughter of the wealthy Eastern Duke, adorned in crimson silk and dripping with pearls representing a political alliance. The Henderson pack desperately needed to secure their borders. Arlo's jaw tightened. He closed the distance between himself and Rosalind. The hall had grown unnervingly quiet, the pack sensing the sudden shift in the spiritual atmosphere. The elders watched with narrowed eyes. "Arlo!" Rosalind breathed, the name tasting like honey and ash on her tongue. Her hands trembled as she took a half-step toward him, compelled by a force older than time. Arlo did not reach for her. Instead, he straightened his spine, projecting his voice so that every lichen in the cavernous hall could hear him. "I, Arlo Henderson, here to the western reaches," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth, cutting through the silence like a rusted blade, "to formally and entirely reject you, Rosalind Cartwright, as my fated mate." The words were a physical blow. The invisible tether that had just bound them suddenly pulled taut and snapped. Rosalind screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure agony that tore from her throat as she collapsed onto the cold stone floor. It felt as though a serrated knife had been dragged down her sternum, ripping her soul in half. The pain was blinding, suffocating. She clutched her chest, gasping for air that wouldn't fill her lungs. Whispers erupted around her, mocking laughter, pitying sighs. An Omega, she heard Lord Reginald scoff from the high table. The goddess has a cruel sense of humor. Good on the boy for doing what must be done. Arlo stood over her writhing form, his expression an impenetrable mask of stone. "You are nothing but a common healer, Rosalind. You are weak. You bring no strength, no wealth, no power to my bloodline. I will not tether the future of this pack to a peasant." He turned his back on her, extending his arm to Lady Catherine, who descended the steps with a triumphant smirk. "Get her out of my sight," Arlo ordered the guards without looking back. "Her scent sickens me." Two heavy-set enforcers grabbed Rosalind by the arms, dragging her limp, agonizingly weak body out of the great hall and throwing her into the freezing mud of the courtyard. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her out in the dark, freezing cold. The rejection of a mate was a death sentence for a weak wolf. Without the bond to anchor her, the physical trauma would fester, rotting her from the inside out. As the snow began to fall, burying her in a shroud of white, Rosalind lay in the mud, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She was 18, she was rejected, and she was alone. But as the blinding pains subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, a new emotion took root in the hollow cavern of her chest. It was not despair, it was pure, unadulterated survival. To remain in the western reaches was to accept a life worse than death. A rejected female held no status. She would become the property of the pack, a slave to be passed around the lowest ranks, forced to bear the brunt of their cruelty, her spirit broken until her wolf simply faded away. Rosalind knew the laws, and she knew the cruelty of the Henderson men. Dragging her battered body through the snow, Rosalind reached the small, drafty apothecary hut she called home on the edge of the territory. The pain in her chest flared with every breath, a phantom blade twisting in her heart, but she forced herself to move. She had only hours before the morning patrols would find her and drag her to the slave quarters. She stripped off the mud-soaked wool dress, donning a pair of heavy riding trousers, leather boots, and a thick, hooded cloak that belonged to her late father. With frantic, shaking hands, she packed a leather satchel. She ignored the meager rations of bread and cheese, focusing instead on her true wealth, her knowledge. She packed vials of wolfsbane extract deadly to her kind, but necessary for masking her scent, along with dried silver leaf for infections, willow bark for the searing pain of the broken bond, and a small rusted hunting knife. Her plan was madness. To the east lay the Bloodwood, a massive, ancient forest so dense and treacherous that even the most seasoned hunters of the pack avoided it. Beyond the Bloodwood were the hinterlands, lawless territories, and further still, the neutral human cities where lichens rarely ventured due to the heavy presence of the king's inquisition. If she crossed the borders, she would become a rogue, hunted, unprotected. But as she looked back at the towering fortress of the Henderson estate, lit up with the fires of the feast celebrating Arlo's new chosen alliance, Rosalind's resolve hardened. She would rather die on her own terms in the frozen mud of the Bloodwood than live as a broken plaything for the man who shattered her soul. She slipped into the night just as a torrential winter storm broke, the moon goddess perhaps offering one final mercy by hiding her tracks. The freezing rain washed away her scent, but it also soaked through her cloak, chilling her to the bone. For 3 weeks Rosalind lived as a ghost. The journey through the Bloodwood was a descent into a primal hell. She dared not shift into her wolf form. Her wolf was too weak from the rejection, whimpering in the back of her mind, refusing to surface. She relied entirely on her human frailty. She slept in hollowed-out logs, buried under wet leaves to hide from the massive feral rogue wolves that stalked the deep woods. She ate bitter roots and scavenged frozen berries, her body wasting away, her cheekbones turning sharp and hollow. The pain of the severed bond was a constant, agonizing companion. Every night, the phantom tether would pull, urging her to return to Arlo, to beg for his mercy. To combat it, she chewed on willow bark until her gums bled, forcing herself to march forward, step by agonizing step. On the 20th day, she nearly met her end at the Whitewater River, the natural border separating the lichen territories from the human realms. The river was a raging torrent of gray, freezing water, choked with jagged ice flows. A Henderson border patrol, a pack of 4 massive gray wolves, had picked up her faint trail. She heard their rhythmic breathing, the snap of twigs under their heavy paws. With no time to hesitate, Rosalind threw herself into the freezing rapids. The water hit her like a wall of concrete. The current dragged her under, tossing her like a rag doll against the rocks. She fought blindly, her lungs burning, the cold seizing her muscles. Just as she felt her consciousness slipping, her hands grasped thick, muddy roots. Dragging herself onto the opposite bank, coughing up freezing water, she lay in the mud and watched as the 4 Henderson wolves paced the opposite shore, growling in frustration. They would not cross into human territory without authorization. She had survived. She was a rogue. She was free. Months passed. Rosalind traveled further south, leaving the deep winters behind for the milder, rain-swept valleys of the human domains. She learned to mask her faint lichen scent entirely, bathing in streams with harsh lye soap and wearing sachets of crushed lavender and dried wolfsbane. She practiced the mannerisms of the human peasantry, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact, and suppressing any display of inhuman speed or strength. Eventually, she arrived at the towering iron-wrought gates of Oakhaven, the bustling, mud-slicked trading capital of the southern realm. The city was a labyrinth of cobblestone streets, towering Gothic cathedrals and crowded marketplaces, choked with the smell of unwashed bodies, roasting meats, and burning coal. It was the perfect place for a ghost to disappear. Using the last of her silver coins, stolen from her father's hidden cache, she secured a position as an assistant to an elderly human apothecary named Master Silas, a man half-blind and deeply grateful for her unparalleled knowledge of herbs. For a year, Rosalind built a life. She became Rose, the quiet, hard-working girl who cured the blacksmith's cough and set the baker's broken arm. The pain of Arlo's rejection settled into a dull, permanent scar tissue over her heart. She thought she had won. She thought the past was dead. She was terribly, catastrophically wrong. Oakhaven was a city of humans, but it existed under the ultimate domain of the High Lycan Crown. The continent was ruled by a hierarchy far above the petty squabbles of dukes and alphas like Arlo's father. At the absolute apex sat the Alpha King, a monarch of terrifying power and absolute authority, who governed both humans and wolves from his fortress in the Obsidian Mountains. King Cedric Valerius was a legend forged in blood. He had taken the throne a decade ago after slaughtering his corrupted uncle, uniting the warring northern and eastern pacts under an iron fist. Tales of his cruelty were whispered in taverns, a man who could shift into a wolf the size of a warhorse, whose very roar could force an alpha to their knees. He was 28, unmarried, and notoriously ruthless. It was mid-autumn when the city of Oakhaven erupted into a frenzy of terrified preparation. The king was conducting a royal tour of the southern territories, enforcing taxation and rooting out corruption, and Oakhaven was his next stop. Banners of black and silver were hastily draped over the grime of the city walls. The streets were swept and the human nobility trembled in their velvet doublets. Rosalind paid the rumors little mind. She had spent the morning in the dark, fragrant back room of the apothecary, grinding dried echinacea. The king of wolves was a god among mortals. He would not concern himself with the slums of Oakhaven, nor would he ever step foot near a human medicinal shop. But on the third day of the king's visit, fate, it seemed, demanded a reckoning. Master Silas had fallen ill, leaving Rosalind to deliver a tincture of digitalis to the estate of a wealthy merchant near the city center. She wrapped herself in her thick, hooded cloak, clutching the glass vial to her chest, and stepped out into the drizzling rain. The main thoroughfare was completely blocked. A massive crowd of human peasants, merchants, and local guards had pressed themselves against the damp stone walls of the buildings, leaving the wide cobblestone street clear. Rosalind tried to push her way through, desperate to avoid the gathering, but she was trapped in the crush of bodies. The king's procession. A woman next to her whispered, pointing a trembling finger up the street. "They are coming from the cathedral." Rosalind froze. The rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of armored warhorses echoed down the corridor of buildings. Then came the scent. It wasn't like the sudden, aggressive storm that had heralded Arlo. This scent was deep, ancient, and overwhelmingly intoxicating. It smelled of dark amber, petrichor, the rich scent of rain on dry earth, and the dangerous metallic tang of drawn steel. It bypassed Rosalind's human senses and struck her dormant inner wolf like a bolt of lightning. Her wolf, which had been silent and broken for a year, suddenly clawed at the front of her mind, wide awake and frantic. "Mine! Mine! Mine!" Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered a violent, bruising rhythm against her ribs. No, she thought wildly, terror turning her blood to ice. No, this is impossible. You only get one mate. The goddess does not grant second chances, that the lore of the elders whispered otherwise in the back of her memory. A second chance mate was a myth, a bedtime story told to grieving widows. It was supposedly reserved only for the most powerful bloodlines, or when the goddess deemed a pairing absolutely vital to the survival of the species. The procession rounded the corner. At the vanguard rode 24 royal enforcers on massive black steeds, their armor gleaming in the dull afternoon light. But Rosalind didn't see them. Her eyes were locked onto the man riding at the center of the formation, King Cedric Valerius, who was a nightmare of masculinity and lethal grace. Clad in dark leather armor layered with heavy silver plates, a cloak of dire wolf fur spilling over his broad shoulders. He sat atop his warhorse with the relaxed posture of a predator, entirely confident in his dominance. His face was a harsh landscape of sharp angles scarred along the jawline, framed by dark, wind-blown hair. His eyes were a startling, piercing silver. As the king drew closer, the suffocating aura of his power pressed down on the crowd. Humans lowered their heads instinctively, unable to bear the weight of his presence. Rosalind tried to shrink back, pulling her hood low over her face, praying the rain and the thick smell of the unwashed masses would hide her. But as Cedric rode parallel to where she stood hidden in the throng, the wind shifted. The king's massive warhorse suddenly sidestepped, tossing its head. Cedric pulled back on the reins, bringing the beast to a halt. The entire procession stopped instantly. The city street fell into a dead, terrified silence, save for the patter of the rain. Cedric's head snapped up. His silver eyes narrowed, scanning the sea of faces with a sudden, predatory intensity. His nostrils flared. Rosalind watched in absolute horror as the king's gaze swept over the crowd and then, with terrifying precision, locked onto her hooded figure. The impact of his stare was physical. The air was sucked from Rosalind's lungs. The tether that had been so brutally severed by Arlo reformed in a fraction of a second, but this time it wasn't a fragile thread. It was a thick, burning cable of pure, undeniable power that anchored her directly to the High King. Cedric's expression shifted from cold indifference to sheer, possessive shock. His silver eyes bled into a glowing, luminescent gold, the absolute mark of a recognized mate. He opened his mouth, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest that echoed off the stone buildings, causing the humans around Rosalind to whimper and step back, inadvertently leaving her standing alone in a small clearing within the crowd. "Mine," the king murmured. His voice was low, rough as sandpaper, yet it carried across the distance, slipping straight into her mind. Panic, sharp and blinding, overrode the mate bond. Rosalind remembered the pain. She remembered the mud, the rejection, the agonizing year of starvation and fear. She would not be dragged back into the world of wolves. She would not be a plaything for a monster king who could crush her with a thought. Without a second of hesitation, Rosalind turned and bolted. She shoved past the stunned humans, diving into a narrow, dark alleyway between a tavern and a butcher shop. "Stop her!" she heard a royal guard shout. "No!" roared the king, a sound that shook the very foundations of the street. "Lock down the city. Seal the gates. No one leaves Oakhaven. Bring her to me." Unharmed, Rosalind sprinted through the mud, her lungs burning, the glass vial of medicine shattering in her pocket. She had fled the air, only to be hunted by the king, and she knew with terrifying certainty that King Cedric Valerius was not a man who ever lost his prey. The labyrinthine alleys of Oakhaven were a twisted knot of shadows and rot, but fear gave Rosalind wings. She tore through the narrow passageways, her boots slipping on the slick, garbage-strewn cobblestones. Behind her, the city was erupting. The tolling of the great iron bells of St. Clement's Cathedral began to ring, a deafening, rhythmic clang that signaled a total lockdown. The heavy portcullises of the city gates would be dropping. She was trapped in a cage with a monster. She could not return to the apothecary shop. If the king's guards tracked her scent, she would only lead them to old Master Bartholomew, sealing his execution for harboring a fugitive. She needed deep cover. She needed the earth. Gasping for breath, her lungs burning with the icy autumn air, Rosalind darted toward the ancient graveyard behind the cathedral. The catacombs beneath St. Clement's were a sprawling network of forgotten crypts, smelling so fiercely of decaying limestone and damp earth that it could mask even the sharpest lichen nose. She threw her weight against the rusted iron grate of a mausoleum, slipping into the pitch-black descent just as a squad of royal enforcers thundered past the graveyard walls. Rosalind scrambled down the damp stone steps, plunging into the suffocating darkness of the crypts. She navigated by touch, her hands tracing the cold, carved stone of the tombs. She needed to reach the deepest sublevel, a place where the air was entirely stagnant. But as she rounded a corner into a cavernous ossuary, a sudden, sharp scent pierced the dampness. It wasn't the rich amber and petrichor of the king. It was the foul, distinct stench of wet dog, stale ale, and blood. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth, yanking her violently backward. Rosalind thrashed, her weak inner wolf whimpering in terror as her spine slammed against a hard, armored chest. A rough, calloused hand grabbed a fistful of her hair, jerking her head back to expose her throat. "Well, well," a raspy, cruel voice whispered in her ear. "Look what the sewer washed up, little Rosalind." The Omega who refused to die. Panic seized her throat. She knew that voice. It was Gideon Finch, the chief tracker and executioner for the Henderson Pack. What was he doing in Oakhaven? "Lord Reginald thought you'd frozen in the bloodwood," Gideon sneered, pressing the icy edge of a hunting knife against her carotid artery. But Lady Catherine, she wasn't convinced. A smart female, our new future Luna. She pays me well to ensure there are no loose ends that might embarrass Lord Arlo's reign. Imagine my surprise when I catch your scent while having a pint in this filthy human city, only to find the whole royal guard chasing you. Rosalind struggled wildly, kicking backward, but Gideon was a hardened warrior. He twisted her hair tighter, bringing tears to her eyes. "Hold still, little bird," Gideon hissed. "I'll make it quick. I'll take your head back to the west in a sack and collect my gold." He raised the blade. Rosalind squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the agonizing sting of steel. "Touch her, and I will tear your arms from their sockets and beat you to death with them." The voice did not just echo in the cavern. It seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of Rosalind's bones. Gideon froze, the knife hovering an inch from her skin. The shadows at the far end of the ossuary seemed to detach themselves from the walls. King Cedric Valerius stepped into the dim light cast by the grate above. He was no longer trying to contain his aura. The sheer, crushing weight of his dominance flooded the room. It was absolute and terrifying, a physical pressure that forced the air from the lungs and commanded total submission. Gideon's knees buckled under the alpha command, but fear kept his grip locked on Rosalind. "Sire," Gideon stammered, his bravado entirely evaporating, replaced by raw, primal terror. "My king, I am a sworn man of the Western Reaches. I am executing a rogue of my pack under the laws of you are holding a blade to my mate," Cedric interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, lethal purr. His silver eyes were completely consumed by a blinding, predatory gold. His claws had extended, slicing effortlessly through the leather of his own gauntlets. Gideon's breath hitched. "Mate?" "No, sire, she is a reject." Cedric moved faster than the human eye could track. There was a rush of displaced air, a terrifying blur of motion, and then Gideon was gone from behind Rosalind. She collapsed to the stone floor, gasping. She heard a sickening crunch of bone, followed by a wet, gargling scream that was abruptly cut short. She didn't look. She clamped her hands over her ears, trembling violently, curling into a tight ball against a stone sarcophagus. Silence fell over the crypt, heavy and suffocating. Then the slow, deliberate sound of heavy boots approaching. Rosalind squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking down her cheeks. She was trading one monster for another. She waited for the brutal hand to grab her, to drag her away to a new hell. Instead, an overwhelming warmth enveloped her. A large, calloused hand, stripped of its gauntlet, touched her shoulder with agonizing gentleness. "Look at me," Cedric commanded, but there was no alpha compulsion in his tone, now only a desperate, raw plea. Rosalind slowly opened her eyes. The terrifying king of the lichens was kneeling on the filthy floor of the crypt. His golden eyes swept over her shivering form, taking in her bruised wrists, her ragged clothes, and the terrified tears on her face. A muscle in his jaw feathered, a flash of murderous rage crossing his features before he aggressively banked it, forcing his expression into a mask of calm. "You are safe," Cedric whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't place. He slowly reached out, unfastening his heavy direwolf fur cloak and wrapping it around her small, shivering frame. The scent of himamber and rain was a narcotic, soothing the phantom aches in her chest that had plagued her for a year. "Why did you run from me?" he asked, his golden eyes searching hers. "I am broken," Rosalind choked out, the bitter truth falling from her lips before she could stop it. "I am an Omega, a rejected runaway. I have nothing for a king." Cedric's hand moved to cup her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. "You are mine," he stated, a vow etched in stone. "And anyone who has made you believe you are broken will burn." Without another word, he scooped her into his arms, holding her tightly against his armored chest, and carried her out of the darkness. The high citadel of Oakhaven was a fortress of polished white stone overlooking the squalor of the city below. For 3 days Rosalind had been kept in the royal wing, a prisoner in a gilded cage. But it was a cage unlike any she had known. Her chambers were vast, adorned with tapestries of spun silver and midnight blue silk. Human servants, led by a gentle elderly woman named Beatrice, attended to her every need. They bathed her in scented oils, dressed her in gowns of velvet and fine linen, and fed her roasted meats and honeyed fruits until the hollows of her cheeks began to fill out. Through it all, the king kept his distance, though his presence was a constant heavy blanket over the citadel. He visited her only once a day, in the evenings. He would sit in the armchair by the roaring hearth, asking her quiet questions about her knowledge of herbs and healing, never pushing her, never forcing the bond that hummed violently between them. His restraint was a masterclass in iron will. Rosalind could feel his wolf pacing at the edge of her consciousness, desperate to claim her, to mark her. But Cedric held the beast back, waiting for her fear to subside. It was maddening. Rosalind was waiting for the cruelty. She was waiting for the moment he realized she was flawed, that her inner wolf was weak and traumatized. But the cruelty never came. Instead, the golden thread connecting their souls grew thicker, warmer, healing the jagged scars left by Arlo's rejection. On the 4th day, the fragile peace shattered. Rosalind was sitting by the towering arched window of her chamber, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk, reading a heavy leather-bound medical text Cedric had gifted her. A sudden sharp knock sounded at the heavy oak doors. Before she could answer, Cedric strode in. He was dressed for court-heavy black velvet slashed with silver, the crown of the High Alpha resting upon his brow, but his jaw was tight, his silver eyes flashing with a dangerous, turbulent light. "Rosalind," he said, his voice clipped. "There is a delegation arriving in the Great Hall. The Western Reaches have come to pay their annual tithes to the crown." The heavy book slipped from Rosalind's hands, hitting the plush rug with a dull thud. The blood drained from her face. "The West?" she whispered, her heart seizing. "Lord Reginald Henderson," Cedric confirmed, his eyes narrowing as he watched her reaction. "And his son, the heir, Arlo." Rosalind's breathing turned erratic. The phantom pain in her chest, the ghost of the rejection flared, warring with the protective warmth of the king's bond. "They cannot know I am here. If they see me, they will claim me as a runaway. Under the old laws, they have the right to execute me." Cedric crossed the room in 2 long strides, dropping to one knee before her chair. He took her trembling hands in his massive ones. "No law in this world supersedes my claim," he growled softly. "You are not a runaway. You are the queen of the lichens. But you must face them. The bond between us cannot fully settle while the trauma of your past holds your wolf hostage. You must look the man who broke you in the eye and know that he cannot touch you." "I am terrified," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I know," Cedric said, lifting her knuckles to his lips. "But I will be right beside you. I will not let you fall." An hour later, Rosalind stood behind the heavy mahogany doors of the citadel's great hall, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear the murmurs of the gathered nobles inside, the clinking of goblets, and then the booming voice of Lord Reginald Henderson presenting his tithe to the throne. Cedric stood beside her, radiating a calming, mountainous strength. He offered his arm. Taking a deep breath, Rosalind placed her trembling hand on his sleeve. The guards threw open the doors. The great hall was a sea of opulent nobility, but as the king entered, a hushed silence fell over the room. Rosalind kept her chin high, focusing on the massive obsidian throne at the end of the long crimson carpet. She felt the eyes of 100 lords and ladies on her, but it was the scent that hit her first, the familiar, arrogant musk of winter pine and mint. Standing at the foot of the dais was Lord Reginald, and beside him, dressed in his finest ceremonial armor, was Arlo. As Cedric led Rosalind down the carpet, Arlo turned his head. The heir's amber eyes lazily swept over the king's new companion, expecting a high-born princess of the east or north. But as his gaze locked onto Rosalind's face, Arlo physically recoiled. All the color drained from his bronze skin, his mouth parted in absolute uncomprehending shock. He remembered the dirty, starving Omega in the coarse wool dress. He remembered throwing her in the mud, but the woman walking beside the king was a vision of radiant, terrifying beauty. The emerald silk clung to her curves. Her dark hair cascaded in loose waves down her back, and her skin glowed with the undeniable, intoxicating aura of a king's chosen mate. Because Rosalind had survived the rejection, the severing of their fated bond had never truly completed. By the cruel laws of Lycan magic, seeing her now, elevated and thriving, violently triggered Arlo's dormant wolf. The realization of what he had thrown away slammed into him with the force of a battering ram. Rosalind felt his shock. She felt the sudden, desperate flare of possessiveness radiating from Arlo. But as she looked at him, she realized something profound. He looked small. The terrifying prince of her nightmares was nothing compared to the quiet, monolithic power of the king beside her. Cedric guided Rosalind up the steps of the dais, seating her on the smaller throne of carved silver to his right before taking his own seat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his golden eyes pinning the Henderson men. "Lord Reginald," Cedric's voice echoed like thunder in the silent hall. "You bring the tithe of the West." Yes, my king," Reginald stammered, his eyes darting frantically between Cedric and Rosalind. He too had recognized her, and the terror of the implications was written plainly on his sweating brow. Arlo, however, could not contain the violent storm in his chest. His inner wolf was screaming at him, demanding he take back what was his. Jealousy, hot and venomous, overrode his common sense. He took a reckless step forward, bypassing his father. "My king, forgive me," Arlo said, his voice tight, his amber eyes locked onto Rosalind with a sickening mixture of rage and sudden lust. "But there has been a grievous error. The woman seated beside you is a criminal. She is Rosalind Cartwright, a lowly Omega and a fugitive of the Henderson pack. She belongs in our dungeons, not upon a throne." The great hall erupted in gasps. A deathly silence followed. Cedric did not yell. He did not move, but the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows in the hall seemed to lengthen, creeping toward the dais. The king tilted his head, his silver eyes flashing gold. "Are you accusing my fated mate, the queen of this realm, of theft, Arlo Henderson?" Arlo flinched, the words fated mate hitting him like a physical blow. "Sire," She is my. Arlo choked on the words, unable to confess to the king that he had rejected the very woman the goddess had now given to the crown. Rosalind gripped the arms of her silver throne. The fear was gone, replaced by a sudden blazing fire in her veins. She stood up, her emerald gown cascading around her. For the first time in her life, her inner wolf roared, not in pain, but in absolute dominant fury. "A criminal, Lord Arlo." Rosalind's voice rang out through the cavernous great hall. It was no longer the trembling whisper of a beaten servant. It was a sound layered with an ancient echoing resonance, the undeniable cadence of an alpha. The nobles in the room exchanged bewildered, fearful glances. A woman of Omega status could not command the room's acoustics in such a manner. Arlo himself took a physical step back, the arrogance on his handsome face fracturing into utter confusion. Rosalind slowly descended the first 2 steps of the dais, the heavy emerald silk of her gown brushing against the crimson carpet. She did not look back at Cedric, but she felt his immense power blanketing her, a fortress of pure gold reinforcing her fractured spirit. "I am no fugitive," Rosalind continued, her gaze pinning the air to the floor. "And I belong in no one's dungeon. But since you are so eager to speak of crimes before the High King, let us bear the truth to the court. Tell them, Arlo. Tell them what happened on the night of the winter solstice, in the great hall of your father's estate." Arlo's jaw clamped shut. His amber eyes darted toward the towering, obsidian-clad figure of King Cedric, who sat perfectly still, his silver-gold eyes watching Arlo with the detached curiosity of a hawk observing a cornered mouse. "Tell them," Cedric commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the stones of the floor. "Or I shall tear the memory from your mind and project it onto the walls of this hall for all to see." Arlo swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing the sharp line of his jaw. I performed my duty as heir," he stammered, the words sounding hollow and pathetic in the grandiose chamber. "I secured a strong alliance with Lady Catherine, for the good of the pack. By discarding the mate the moon goddess chose for you," Rosalind finished, her voice slicing through his excuses like a freshly whetted blade. The collective gasp from the hundreds of gathered nobles sucked the oxygen from the room. To reject a fated mate was not just a personal cruelty. It was a blasphemy of the highest order, a direct insult to their deity that brought famine and ruin upon a bloodline. "You cast me into the freezing mud to die, Arlo," Rosalind said, her tone devoid of the tears she had shed for a year. "You shattered my soul for political gain. And now, seeing me under the protection of the crown, your pride cannot bear the thought that the filthy Omega you threw away has survived your cruelty. You are a liar," Lord Reginald suddenly bellowed, stepping forward, his face flushed a dangerous mottled purple. He bowed frantically toward Cedric. "My king, do not listen to this serpent. She is a manipulator, a low-born cur who has somehow bewitched your senses. She is Rosalind Cartwright, daughter of a peasant healer. She carries wheat blood. She is unfit to stand in your presence, let alone sit upon the silver throne." Cedric finally moved. He leaned back against the obsidian throne, steepled his fingers, and let out a dark, humorless chuckle that sent shivers down the spines of the closest lords. "It is fascinating, Lord Reginald," Cedric mused smoothly, "how confidently a man will weave a noose for his own neck." The king raised 2 fingers. From the shadows behind the throne, the royal spymaster Lord Harrington, a slender, calculating lichen with eyes like chips of flint, stepped forward. In his hands he carried a heavy, iron-bound chest, the seal of the Western Reaches stamped into its rusted lock. Reginald's face went entirely slack. All the blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him the color of old parchment. "When my mate's bonds snapped into place in the streets of Oakhaven," Cedric explained, his voice echoing in the deathly silent hall. I felt the trauma scarring her soul. I felt the unnatural suppression of her inner wolf. So, I sent Lord Harrington and a detachment of my elite shadows to your estate, Lord Reginald, to uncover why a woman destined to be queen was living as a starving apothecary's assistant. Harrington unlocked the chest, pulling out a stack of yellowed, crumbling journals in a velvet pouch. The woman you call Rosalind Cartwright, Harrington announced to the court, his voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a death sentence, is not a Cartwright at all. Her father was not a peasant healer. She is Rosalind Whitmore, the sole surviving heir of the Silvervire Pack, the Northern Territory your forces brutally slaughtered 18 years ago. Lord Reginald. Pandemonium erupted in the hall. The Silvervale Pack had been renowned for their pure, unadulterated alpha bloodline. They were legends of the North, supposedly wiped out by a rogue sickness, according to the history Reginald had fed the crown. Silence, Cedric roared, his alpha aura slamming down on the room like a physical weight, forcing several lesser lords to their knees. He turned his burning gaze back to Reginald, who was trembling uncontrollably. You murdered her family to steal the Silvervale lands, Cedric stated, his voice a lethal whisper. But you kept the infant, a trophy, and to ensure she could never challenge you or awaken her true alpha strength, you forced the pack healer, Thomas Cartwright, to raise her in squalor. You laced her daily meals with microdoses of refined wolfsbane and silver ash for 18 years, crippling her inner wolf, keeping her locked in a state of eternal weakness. Rosalind's breath hitched. Her hands flew to her mouth, the years of agonizing lethargy. The headaches, the inability to shift fully without collapsing it hadn't been a defect. It had been poison. Reginald had systematically poisoned her for her entire life to steal her birthright. Arlo looked at his father, horror and disgust warping his features. He had been oblivious to the depth of the treason. He had rejected Rosalind because he believed she was weak, an omega. The realization that he had thrown away an alpha female of royal northern blood, the most coveted prize in the Lycan world, fractured the last remaining shards of his sanity. The severed mate bond, combined with the catastrophic realization of his monumental mistake, triggered a violent, agonizing break in Arlo's mind. His eyes rolled back, a guttural, tearing scream ripped from his throat as his bones began to brutally snap and reform against his will. He's losing control. Someone shouted as the courtiers scrambled backward, knocking over heavy mahogany tables and silver goblets. Arlo dropped to his hands and knees, his fine ceremonial armor tearing like paper as coarse bronze fur erupted from his skin. The shift was unnatural, driven by madness rather than intent. Within seconds, a massive, slavering bronze wolf stood in the center of the great hall, its amber eyes locked onto Cedric with homicidal, jealous rage. The beast snarled, saliva dripping from its massive fangs, and launched itself not at the king, but straight at Rosalind. Time seemed to fracture, stretching into agonizing slow-motion fragments. Rosalind saw the bronze beast tearing through the air toward her, its jaws wide, aiming to rip her throat out in a desperate, crazed attempt to reclaim the bond he had broken. But Cedric was faster. The king did not even bother to fully shift. He intercepted Arlo midair, a blur of black velvet and terrifying speed. Cedric's hand, now tipped with razor-sharp obsidian claws, clamped down on the thick scruff of the bronze wolf's neck. With a roar that shattered the stained glass windows of the great hall, Cedric slammed the massive beast into the stone floor. The impact cracked the foundational flagstones, sending a shock wave through the room. Arlo whimpered, pinned beneath the crushing weight of the king's boot. Reginald, seeing his son and his dynasty crumbling in seconds, drew a concealed silver dagger from his boot and charged Cedric's exposed back. It was in that fraction of a second that the final remnants of the poison in Rosalind's veins burned away. The overwhelming, protective fury of the mate bond surged through her system, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated moonlight. Rosalind didn't think. She let her instincts take the reins. The shift, which had once been a source of agonizing pain, was instantaneous and euphoric. There was no snapping of bones, only a blinding flash of incandescent light. Where the woman in the emerald gown had stood, a magnificent wolf now materialized. She was breathtaking. Larger than any normal female, her coat was a blinding, iridescent silver white that seemed to radiate its own ethereal glow. Her eyes were pools of piercing, luminous violet. With a speed that eclipsed even the king's, the silver wolf lunged. She intercepted Reginald before he could close the distance, her jaws clamping down on his wrist with bone-crushing force. The silver dagger clattered uselessly to the floor. She tossed the screaming alpha of the West across the room like a discarded toy, where he smashed into a stone pillar and crumpled, unconscious and defeated. The great hall was frozen in absolute awe. The legend of the Silvervale Alpha bloodline stood before them, radiant and terrifying, standing protectively over her mate. Arlo, still pinned beneath Cedric, let out a pitiful whining sound, his crazed eyes staring at the magnificent silver beast that could have been his. The regret in his gaze was a physical, palpable agony. Cedric looked down at the bronze wolf, his golden eyes burning with lethal intent. He raised his hand, his claws fully extended, preparing to deliver the executioner's strike and separate Arlo's head from his shoulders. But the silver wolf moved, nudging Cedric's arm with her cold nose. Rosalind stepped forward, placing herself between the king and the broken heir. She looked down at Arlo. Through the strange telepathic network of the pack dynamics, her voice echoed in the minds of everyone in the room. It was calm, regal, and utterly cold. "Death is a mercy you have not earned, Arlo Henderson," she projected. "Huh, you cast me out because you deemed me weak. You believed power was the only measure of worth. Now you shall live out your days knowing exactly what you threw away." Oh. She turned her massive silver head toward Cedric, signaling her judgment. The king understood. He stepped back, allowing his queen to pass sentence. "By the ancient laws of the moon goddess," Heir Rosalind's voice boomed in their minds. "I, Rosalind Whitmore, Queen of the Lycans, strip the Henderson family of all titles, lands, and wealth. You and your father are hereby banished to the Bloodwood. You shall live as rogues, hunted and despised until the end of your miserable days." Arlo lowered his heavy bronze head to the cracked stone floor, a gesture of absolute, devastating submission. His punishment was sealed. He would roam the frozen wilds just as he had forced her to do, but he would do it carrying the maddening knowledge of the kingdom and the mate he had squandered. The royal guards immediately dragged the limp form of Reginald and the broken bronze wolf out of the great hall, their exile beginning the moment they crossed the threshold. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer thick with terror. It was saturated with reverence. One by one, the nobles of the realm dropped to their knees, bowing their heads, exposing their throats in absolute submission to their new queen. Cedric shifted fully back to his human form. He did not care about the hundreds of bowing lords. His golden eyes were fixed solely on the magnificent silver wolf standing before him. Rosalind allowed her form to ripple, melting back into her human skin. The emerald gown reformed around her perfectly. She stood tall, her chest heaving slightly, the phantom pain of the past completely, irrevocably erased from her heart. She was whole. Cedric stepped forward, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. inhaling the intoxicating scent of winter pine and blooming roses that was now fully hers. "My beautiful, terrifying queen," Cedric murmured, his lips pressing a burning kiss to the skin just below her ear, right over her pulse point. "You have no idea how long I have waited for you." Rosalind wrapped her arms around his neck, tangling her fingers in his dark hair. She looked out over the sea of kneeling nobles, over the kingdom that was now hers to rule and protect. She had been a slave, a runaway, and a ghost. But as the Alpha King's fated mate pressed his mark into her skin, binding their souls together for eternity, Rosalind finally knew what it meant to be home. The girl who had fled into the snow to die had vanished. The Queen of the Wolves had risen. Thank you for journeying into the treacherous and passionate world of the Lycan monarchy. If your heart raced during Rosalind's epic revenge, and you swooned over King Cedric's fierce devotion, please smash that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling werewolf drama. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite twist. Do you think Arlo got what he deserved? See you in the next epic tale.